Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Australian CFO Summit. We are thrilled to have you here today. In the spirit of reconciliation, WEAL respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. Hello and welcome. We have the second of the Australian CFO Summit with the theme Protecting Profit in 2023. And we are very lucky to have Richard joining us here today for our economic update. Richard is the Chief Economist and Head of Research at ANZ, based in Sydney. And he leads the bank's global research team, so focused on Australia and New Zealand and Asia. I have a lesser title, and I will be fading into the background because I have very little of value to add to this conversation. I work behind the scenes of the CFO Summit and work on the marketing team for WEAL. Before we begin, I'd really like to thank all of our sponsors today that have made this huge summit possible. So Fathom, My Accounts, F-Shore, CFO Magazine, EXL Cloud, Elena Bennett, McKay Goodwin, and Easy Collect. Now, few little housekeeping. We really want this to be interactive. So anytime you've got a question, just use the chat function or pop it in the Q&A. I will be monitoring that, and at the end of Richard's stellar session, I will be posing those questions. It will be around a 30-35 minute session, and then we'll have questions at the end. And for some reason, you get a call, your children start crying or something like that, you need to get another cup of tea, the session will be recorded and will be made available for you hopefully tonight, definitely tomorrow, depending on how late we finish up here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard and fade off into the background. I hope you enjoy it all, and I will see you soon.
Thanks, Adriana, for that kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm an economist, so I travel with slides. Let me, there we go. I hope everybody can see that. I mean, us economists have a bit of a reputation for bringing the bad news, and maybe the bad news is interest rates in the current economic cycle. But the good news is demand is really, really strong. That's why we have an inflation challenge. That's why we have an interest rate challenge. And I want to talk about that setup and why we have this setup and where I think it's going. No immaculate evaporation of inflation. You know, I live in a probabilistic world. I think about what's most likely and try and work out which of the unlikely outcomes I should be worried about. But certainly the least likely outcome is that we can get inflation back to target in Australia or anywhere else scot-free. It's likely we are going to have some economic bumps. I know people like to divide the world into soft landings and hard landings. I don't know that it's that straightforward, but certainly I don't expect too many bumps, but that's not saying we shouldn't expect some, because in fact, wherever I look, what I see in the world is demand for resources. Lots of things to do. And of course, we live in a world of finite resources, particularly when, if you look at the right-hand column on this of this table, the second bottom item, climate change, in a world where we're also trying to undertake the largest infrastructure swap in history to then go and have lots of, you know, BAU demands is a really difficult environment. And that, I think, in a nutshell, is the challenge we're facing today. If I'd spoken to you pre-pandemic, I would have shown you some version of the left-hand side of this table where most of the things that I think drive inflation, both in Australia and in a global sense, because of course the two are quite closely linked, as the Reserve Bank of Australia has acknowledged a few times through this interest rate tightening cycle. Most of the things pre-pandemic suggested inflation was low and would stay low. And yet from about 2016 onwards, when we had the Brexit vote and Trump's election, both of which were anti-globalization votes, we started to see some changes. And where we sit today, most of the things that I can identify suggest that there's upward pressure on inflation. I do think the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Fed want to get inflation back to target. So I don't think this implies sustainably higher inflation forever, but it does mean, I think, we're in an environment where central banks have to work hard to get inflation back to target and keep it there, as opposed to that pre-pandemic decade where the effort really was raising inflation to get back to target. And in fact, if you think about the federal government budget in Australia just a couple of weeks ago, and you think about that list of issues in green, demographics, the budget is very much dealing with an aged care challenge. We are in a particular demographic adjustment in Australia. In the last 15 to 20 years, if you look at the growth in the over 80s population, that increased by roughly 20 to 25,000 people a year. It actually was very consistent for quite a long period of time. We're in the middle of a 7-year period where instead of 20 to 25,000 annual increases, that's going to about 65,000 a year. And then it will sit there for a while. And if you think about where we are today in 2023, we're almost exactly 80 years on from the end of the Second World War. So these are the baby boomers post-Second World War hitting 80 years old and changing that demographic picture. Clearly, there's supply chain reorientation. We read about that every day. Fiscal policy, governments in Australia and elsewhere became much more active during the pandemic. Fiscal expenditure as a share of GDP went up. Most governments in Australia and elsewhere are struggling to step back from that broader role. In fact, in the recent federal government budget in Australia, apart from 2020, which was of course a little bit of a crazy year, the next 4 years in the forward estimates, expenditure as a share of GDP will be higher than at any time since the mid-1980s. And by the end of the forward estimates in 5 years, revenue as a share of GDP will be higher than at any time since the 1970s. So fiscal policy definitely much more active, using more resources. Commodity underinvestment, climate change, affordable housing. There's demands on resources. That's a more inflationary environment. It's a stronger demand environment, but the cost of that is higher interest rates. For our forecast for Australia, what drops out of that is, sure, you know, I have a view on, is the Reserve Bank finished? Do they have one more? Do they have two more? I mean, our answer is they have one more interest rate hike. I'm more worried about the top side of that than the bottom. I'm more worried about more than one rather than less. But maybe the key message, if I can leave you with on interest rates, is no meaningful easing cycle in our forecast horizon. The demand for resources, I think, means much of the increase in interest rates we've seen through this tightening cycle is likely to be pretty structural. In line with that idea that the Reserve Bank finishes at some point not too far away, we have inflation back to about 3.5% over 2024, and that's an average number for the year. So it's starting the year higher and finishing lower. That takes inflation back to the Reserve Bank's target band by the end of the next year. I think that's about the outside of the time frame they would like to see to get inflation back to target. You can't keep talking about a target and wish credibility on it while you sustain inflation outside the target for a run of years. It does start to affect price and wage setting behaviour in the economy. And I think you can start to see, if you look around at different industries, a sense that things are a little bit different. Firms are more willing to pass price increases on. They're taking account of future price increases in their forward planning. The good news, and I'll keep coming back to this, I don't know, it doesn't always resonate when we're talking about higher interest rates, but the good news is this outcome in terms of interest rates is not at the cost of a very poor economic performance. 2.1% GDP growth this year and 1.5 next year are our forecast. 1.5 is not a fantastic outcome, but I think if Australia gets inflation from 7 to 8 back to 2 to 3, and the 1.5 GDP outcome is the worst the economy gets, that will be an absolutely fantastic performance, I would argue, and a great recovery by policymakers to bring us back to something like that. This demand on resources wouldn't be as acute without the pandemic-related stimulus. And I know the stimulus was now about 3 years ago, but it continues to resonate. There is no, as an economist, obviously the pandemic itself is something that we all lived through and set that period apart from many other. But as an economist, the thing that really sets the pandemic apart is the stimulus. There is no historical precedent for the global stimulus that was unleashed, particularly in March and April 2020, but then over the rest of 2020 and maintained through the entirety of 2021. The global fiscal stimulus, the IMF, puts at 6 times the size of the GFC. The increases in money supply you can see on this chart, which almost entirely occurred during 2020 and 2021, are almost without precedent. I mean, they're typically the sort of money supply increases you would either see in very high inflation economies or actually in economies that are needing to fund some sort of large scale military expenditure where effectively the entire economy is being forced to deliver resources to that sector. In kind of peacetime, in response to an economic stimulus, these money supply increases are unprecedented. The combination of this stimulus, the nature of the pandemic, and the resilience of balance sheets is what I think has given us this enormous trampoline springboard out of the pandemic. The stimulus I've just spoken about, the nature of the pandemic, what I mean by that is the pandemic was very different from the global financial crisis. The financial crisis was very much an endogenous crisis, a crisis within the system. We worried about the stability of the system. So as we liquefied balance sheets and accumulated liquidity during the GFC, we held that liquidity for quite a number of years because we feared who was the next Lehman, who was the next Greece, where was the next problem going to come from. We retained that sense of caution for a long period of time. So the recovery out of the GFC was very, very slow, and policy needed to work very hard. The pandemic, for want of another expression, was treated as a gift from the aliens. It came and it went, and we really couldn't wait to get out and start spending as individuals and start investing as businesses. When you apply an enormous amount of stimulus to a crisis which doesn't have long-lasting effects into balance sheets that are very, very strong, you've got a cocktail for a very strong recovery. This is what the US consumer balance sheet has looked like over the last 50 years. You can see the difference between today and the GFC. Absolutely no comparison. Consumers went into the GFC with very vulnerable balance sheets, aggressive increases in debt, asset values which were under pressure because of the weakness in the economy. Both of those conspired together to create enormous problems. In the pandemic period, net wealth at a record high, and in fact it went up because of pandemic-related stimulus, and liabilities actually at about the lowest level since the early 2000s. You can't compare the average consumer in the US today with the GFC. And I am talking averages. Of course, there are households that are much worse off than this that have found this period particularly challenging. And there absolutely is a role for policy to look after those individuals, I would argue. But when we think about the economy overall, the Joe and Helen average household is in remarkably good shape. In Australia, the business sector is in very, very good shape. This is debt of the business sector in Australia as a share of GDP. You can see how uncredit intensive the pandemic-related recovery has been. Debt as a share of GDP, the lowest level since 2006. Corporates are less affected than we've seen in nearly 20 years by rising interest rates. And as a consequence, even as interest rates have gone up, because it's been a real demand story and demand has stayed quite robust, business capital expenditure intentions even now are only back to about the average of that pre-pandemic decade. even with interest rates close to a peak, even with consumer spending now below where it was this time last year. And then if we look at the Australian household balance sheet, and I know this is a bit of a spaghetti western, so let me run through it a little bit. The table there you can see is a snapshot of the latest data points in that chart to the left-hand side. Maybe a couple of things worth calling out. The light blue line at the top, total assets of the household sector, and the grey line at the bottom of that first chart, liabilities of the household sector. There's just a big gap between those two. The dark blue line is net assets. If you wanted to be negative, you could say net assets have fallen by about 100% of GDP, and that would make quite a good headline. But the reality is they've fallen from about 675% of GDP to about 585% of GDP. That takes net household assets back to where they were in 2020. I mean, hardly a terrible story. In fact, a very, very strong story, very, very strong story. The bottom left-hand chart, in fact, household liabilities, if we deflate them by GDP, because GDP has been boosted by inflation, they've actually been falling as a share of the economy. And the bottom right-hand chart just looks at current financial assets, assets that households can easily liquefy if they might have a repayment challenge, household financial assets compared to total liabilities. The gap is as favourable as it's been in about 25 years. There is a kind of bit of myth and legend about the Australian consumer that every consumer is under pressure, every household is under pressure, they're about to fall over. Absolutely, some are, and we should be concerned about that, and there's a role for policy in looking after those individuals and looking after those households. But in aggregate, the household sector is still in very, very strong shape, even with interest rates where they are today. The one thing which could upset this party is some of the issues that have been happening in the US banking sector. Silicon Valley Bank, honestly, I didn't know much about until it was no longer, and other issues in the US banking sector. There has been a tightening in liquidity in response to that. There's little doubt about that. The light blue line on this chart is the commercial and industrial lending standards. The Fed in the US does a survey of what they call senior bank loan officers, the individuals in banks who set lending standards. And you can see 45% of banks are tightening lending standards or were tightening lending standards in the last quarter. Historically, that's consistent with quite a pickup in default rates. Liquidity is tighter. We should expect credit to be less freely available. We should expect credit to be a bit more expensive. So the sort of spreads a borrower might pay on loans, we're in a phase of the cycle where that is widening, as well as the level of rates being official at rates being high. I think corporate spreads generally are going to be under a wider trend. The real question, though, is this relationship, if you look at this chart, covers a lot of territory. There's the GFC style territory where the tightening in lending standards meant a really bad balance sheet recession for the economy. And then there's the pandemic sort of territory where actually it was pretty scary for a while, but the economy held in reasonable shape. And that covers quite a continuum. I think we're more likely to be towards the much more modest end of that continuum. I don't think the tightening in lending standards is consistent with a credit crunch in the US. I think it's consistent with some reduced availability of credit and some increase in the prices of credit rather than credit just stopping like we saw during the GFC. And a key reason is because of the nature of the US financial system. Banks only account for about 40% of the stock of credit outstanding in the US. The US has a much more diversified and diffuse financial system. In fact, the US has a much more diffuse banking system. Australia has about 100 banks. The Australian economy is about 10% the size of the US, let's call it. So 100 banks in Australia might be 1,000 banks in the US, pari passu. The US actually has 4,000 banks. Very long tail of small regional banks and a range of other financial institutions which deliver credit into the economy. Because banks are tightening lending standards because of perceived concerns about stability in deposits rather than stability of their assets. These other lenders are still happy to provide credit. The price might be a bit wider, as you're seeing in widening in credit spreads and widening in funding spreads. But as I say, this is not a credit crunch in my view. It's a slowdown in the pace of credit delivery. It's a tightening in lending standards, and it's a widening in the cost of credit. The good news for Australia, I keep hitting the wrong button. The good news for Australia is this has taken us out of, this whole setup has taken us out of the pre-pandemic decade, which I call Australia's horrendum decennium, Australia's horrible decade. We should not want the economy to go back to where it was in the pre-pandemic decade. In 10-year GDP per average terms, so growth in GDP per capita over the course of a decade, the pre-pandemic decade was the worst since the 1950s. Real median household income between 2012 and 2020 showed no growth at all. It was a lost decade for the average income earner in Australia in real terms. And business investment as a share of GDP fell to a record low. These are all kind of sides of the prism, which also has the Reserve Bank's inflation outcomes on it. Inflation running at 1.5% to 2% rather than 2.5%. Aggregate income growth too weak, not enough going to labour, business activity too weak, GDP too weak, reflected in low inflation. If the Reserve Bank can bring inflation back to the middle of the target band and we can sustain 2.5%, and I think we can, a lot of those variables are going to look quite different. Stronger activity, stronger income, stronger investment. And to get those things, I think we need two variables to stay robust. The first one is the labour market. We need unemployment to stay low and underemployment to stay low. Unemployment and underemployment were too high pre-pandemic. There wasn't enough pricing tension in the labour market. I know that for those of you in business trying to hire people saying, wow, I wish there was a bit less price tension in the labour market. I wish it was a bit easier to hire people. I wish there wasn't as much pressure on wages. I'm absolutely hearing you. But one of the costs of that in the pre-pandemic decade was weak demand. Households were very vulnerable. When they got hit with any sort of negativity, they sucked in their spending. And so the Reserve Bank had to keep easing to try and stimulate the economy. I think we'll find, while this adds some pressure to the business sector, labour that is harder to find is more fully utilised, will be a much better economy. One of the very beneficial side effects is us businesses are being forced to look harder to hire good people. And what we're finding actually is Australia's largest untapped resource in the labour market has been there the whole time. Australia has probably had the most highly skilled, underutilised pool of female labour in the world. And that is changing. Over the course of the first few months of this year, we've hit a number of records in the labour market around women, record high participation rate, record high share of hours worked, record high share of employment, a record high employment to population ratio, record low unemployment, and record low long-term unemployment for women. There's still some wins we can have in the labour market. And it's a bit like the climate transition. If energy is becoming more difficult to source from, more expensive to source because we need to go through this transition, then using it more effectively seems like the first place to start. So energy efficiency, a big issue. If labour is scarce, is more expensive, the right skills harder to find for the right price, I think there are skills there. We as the business sector need to look harder for that. That's one gain through this pandemic recovery. We need to sustain the falls in unemployment and the falls in underemployment. And the second issue is that bottom right-hand chart. The capacity utilisation of the business sector needs to stay high. What is the first requirement for businesses to invest? They're running at full capacity. They can't meet demand even when they're running flat chat. And for that to happen, we need demand to be strong, which goes back to the unemployment story. I think we can sustain these gains, but it's a policy balance absolutely to get there. It's also, this economic setup also is changing the debate around economic reform. And just to, I guess, give government and policymakers a bit of a break, there are no reform levers in Australia of the sort that were used in the 1980s, for instance. In the 1980s, if you float the Aussie dollar and reduce tariffs, what you're really doing is changing the rules around pricing in the economy, and then you leave the private sector to adjust. There are no levers like that left. Economic reform needs to be much more micro, and it's much more difficult, and it's much more challenging. But what this economic setup is, it's changing the debate around reform. In the pre-pandemic decade, when businesses lacked pricing power, whenever they tried to pass on cost increases, they lost demand. Households worried about job security. When they were hit with a negative development, they tended to pull back. That insufficient demand really strangles support for reform, because reform tends to be even more disruptive in the short term. But when it's the supply side of the economy which is lacking, you know, the second income earner in the home might want to work, but it's difficult to get out because you have to travel to work, or traveling is expensive, or you can't get proper childcare. That tends to limit your ability to participate in the labour market, even though you want to. And so what's happened is it's changed the discussion around reform. And childcare is a great example. Childcare used to be talked about as a women's policy or a family policy, kind of a social policy. But now it's spoken about as an economic policy, which is what it is. There are no big levers on reform to pull, but I am hopeful that that what we can see actually is the nature of the discussion around reform continues to shift. And as more people start to realise this is a win-win, because of course, into this environment, we have some really significant challenges. And I spoke about resource demands at the beginning, and you need to look no further in Australia than the issue of housing. The pandemic has changed the nature of occupation in Australia. The fall on this line doesn't look very big, but it occurred in quite a short space of time. And just to put this in context, so this shows the number of people per dwelling in Australia, and that kind of fall over the last 4 or 5 years from about 2.55 people per dwelling to about 2.5 is equivalent to the loss of about 200,000 dwellings in Australia. Now, 200,000 might not sound like a lot in a population of 25 million, but it's equivalent to 1 to 2 years housing construction. This effectively represents the disintegration of group homes through the pandemic. I mean, the price of rentals is telling us some of those group homes are probably being reinvigorated today. That's a pretty painful adjustment, but that also has limits. Housing, clearly a big issue in Australia, upward pressure on prices. And I don't accept, as some people will tell you, oh, it's easy, it's just about supply. If we're going to build even more homes, expect the cost of building to go up even further. And I don't know, some of you may be involved in the construction industry. I suspect even you are saying, yes, I'm charging what seems like a reasonable, significant amount, but actually it also reflects the cost of my inputs. That whole supply chain is likely to become more expensive if we think the answer is just to build more dwellings. I don't think the answers are easy, but certainly it's something we'll need to challenge. Before I reach my closing section, I'll make a few comments about China. China is different from the story I've outlined. It didn't deliver as much excessive stimulus. It doesn't have an excess demand problem. It doesn't have an excess price problem, which is trying to get back to target. In fact, we just halved our inflation forecast for this year from 2.2 to 1.1. China's having problems really getting the economy to get back to the sort of vigor we saw pre-pandemic. And I don't think it's really going to, because what's happened over the course of this pandemic is China's demography has changed. China used to have about 15 to 17 million births a year pre-pandemic. The evidence for this year so far, while it's early, suggests it will be maybe around 8 million, so nearly half actually of what it was in the pre-pandemic period. Last year was a bit shy of 10 million, so not quite half. And that demographic shift, which is stark on any measure, is adding to the demographic shift from the one-child policy, which is coming through. Some people will tell you a shrinking population doesn't have to be a macroeconomic problem for an economy. I think that's true within limits. It is a problem, I think, in an economy where you're already starting with lots of debt. Credit to the non-financial sector in China, 295% of GDP. When you have less people, the debt is still fixed and you still need to service it. And I think you can see in China today that it's just struggling to generate that vigor, that sort of economic rebound we've seen in other places. I think demographics is making itself felt. And part of the consequence of that is businesses are looking elsewhere. It's not, China is still a $17 trillion economy, still the biggest economy in the region, second biggest economy in the world. In fact, Japan is about a $4 or $5 trillion economy. China four times as large, but at the margin, I think the growth in China is leveling off to something that's much, much lower, and businesses will look elsewhere. And one of the places is India. And India is not replacing China within any stretch of the narrative, but certainly at the margin, it's a much more interesting place. It's much more on the map. And as you can see from this chart, India is doing some really interesting things around infrastructure, which are really kickstarting. Let me close with some comments about climate, because I started in the list of inflationary pressures talking about climate. I do think it's an inflationary challenge. And if the objective of a PowerPoint slide is to take the complex and make it simple, clearly I've failed, but in a way, that's my point. You can't have a box for the natural environment transition. And it's not the climate transition anymore. It's about biodiversity and plastic and a whole range of different things. You can't have that in a box. You can't have that as a reporting function in some corporate services division. It needs to be at the leadership table, because climate and the natural environment transition has an impact on inflation. There's a physical risk issue. There's policy risks. It's probably widening the fractions around geopolitics. There's a migration issue that's involved for countries that are disproportionately affected. It won't affect every sector the same, so it's uneven. It probably will leave some stranded assets. And offsets are attractive at an individual business level, but we also need to think about the system. That bottom right-hand box, the Trillion Tree campaign has garnered commitments to plant and restore nearly 1/10 of the world's land, excluding, and I'm missing an apostrophe there, excluding ice and barren rock, or about 1/4 of total agricultural land. The prospect of all of those being delivered when they account for such a large proportion of the world's land is probably in the land of never. At an individual business level, offsets make absolute sense to try and deliver into this transition. At a system level, we haven't quite got the offsets right yet, and we really need to think about, and there will be some structure around that which will limit access. Perhaps the most important message around climate, besides this natural environment transition being here and embedded and being ubiquitous, is that there are parallels with other transitions we've been through. The transition to mechanisation, we're going through potentially a transition to AIization, the transition to trade liberalisation. And this is a comment about Americans, but you can, I'm sure, relate to it as applying to any economy you want to think of. There will be industries and sectors and geographies and individuals that are worse off through the climate transition than others. We need to bring those people with us. If we're going to sustain the effort over a few decades, leaving those communities just to adjust is a surefire way of ensuring they eventually decide they really don't want to be part of that. And we start to have even more problems than we do today getting to the transition we want. I might finish now. If you've heard anything today which you think is interesting and you want to get our research, I don't know, you may want a laugh in your inbox every day. This is a QR code you can scan to take you to sign up. We do have some limitations on the sort of customers we can send it to, but certainly, happy to consider you for research. Thanks Adriana. I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you.
Oh, no, feel free to leave the QR code up for a little bit longer. We've had a few questions. But firstly, thank you so much. I think the sentiment that, often things are perceived as distinctly, environmental issues or social issues, they're actually very crucially an economic issue. Warmed my heart to know that we now have improved the underutilization of highly skilled women. So I was pretty excited to hear that. And what really stuck in my head, actually, which I hadn't really turned my mind to, is this understanding that we don't want to return to the growth that we had pre-pandemic. And that was sort of a lost decade, I think, is how you described it for growth. So very, particularly interesting for me. Few questions that came through, and I do think that you potentially have answered these perhaps throughout, but we'll just, you might just give a quick nod to them as well. You referred to the inflation target. Are you able to remind the audience what is that target that we're looking at?
The Reserve Bank of Australia has a 2 to 3% target, which they express over the medium term, over the course of the economic cycle. So they never claim to try and keep inflation in the target all the time. What they want to do is keep it in the target, so it averages there. And you can see over the course of history, the inflation target really was only adopted in the early 1990s. So you can see over the period through to about 2014, actually, that's what happened. Sometimes it was above, sometimes it was below, but the deviations were typically quite transitory. It was that pre-pandemic period where inflation was just too low. They hadn't quite got on top of that deflationary bias. And then, of course, we have the oopsie, which is the pandemic-related spike, which many economies have seen. So that's the challenge.
We've got another question. So in your view, what are a few key things that could help boost our labour force productivity over the next 5 years?
If the Productivity Commission does a really useful 5-yearly review of productivity where they provide some ideas around those things. And for those of you that operate in or are service businesses like Wheel, you'll relate to the sort of language the Productivity Commission uses. It's not the productivity challenge in Australia is not a manufacturing style challenge. It's not about how to produce widgets more effectively. It's not about robotisation. It's not about high tech necessarily. It's about how do you get the best out of service sectors. And so they use language like agile, flexible workers, lifelong learning, transferable skills. So the policy conclusions that drop out of that, as I said in my comments, are a bit more micro. Women much more appropriately utilised in the labour force. What about migrants? We know migrants struggle to get their external qualifications recognised in Australia. How much of that is appropriate protection of the standards we have in Australia, and how much of that is just protectionism of local occupations? Why can't an electrician move from Victoria to New South Wales? I mean, it's the same electricity, but we haven't got the licensing right. Public transport. People are struggling to come back to the office after COVID, not because they don't like the office. It's because it's getting there is a damn pest. We know that real estate is taxed inappropriately. We know stamp duty inhibits movement of people, raises the risk around changing where you live, which worsens that commute challenge. I wish I could, there's no, as many more famous people than me have said, there's no problem with a list of what reforms to deliver. It's recognising the political and economic challenges of getting those reforms delivered.
So many questions flowing in, so we've got a few more minutes. So Richard, there's been a lot of discussion about the care sector, including NDIS and aged care. Do you see any risks or opportunities for this sector over the next few years?
Both, I would suspect. I think the demographic story that I outlined if you're involved in that sector, paints a very strong growth story, a very strong structural growth story. Of course, part of the challenge is the aged care sector needs to be funded. It's not it's not a traditional business sector. The customers often are not the people that are directly paying. Somebody else often is paying. And so there's a funding challenge that's required. And that is kind of clashing with that sectoral growth story, if you like. And when things like that start to grate against each other, then in the middle you end up with policy risk, because governments are trying to deliver into a requirement, but also trying to deliver into that in a cost-effective way. So certainly one theme, if you like, that exists here is all of these policy challenges, demands on resources, larger government, means the government is more involved in the economy. It is making judgments about different economic sectors in ways it might not have been before, and it may be more involved in your sector than it used to be. So you understanding that policy process and those policy challenges, I think, is equally important.
Just going to keep going quick fire at you.
Sure, I'll answer quickly. Yep.
The most 3 minutes out of you. So we've got in slide 9, where it showed total assets dropping by 100%. The liabilities didn't seem to change that much. Given the current interest rate cycle, is the total assets likely continue to drop as mortgages have servicing issues? And if so, what's the likely impact on the wider economy?
Oh, that's a good question. You would expect there to be kind of a decline in the value of assets as interest rates go up. It has happened in housing in Australia. It hasn't really happened in financial assets yet. So there's probably more of that to come as interest rates really start to bite. But also the household savings rate is still positive. It's lower than it was, but it's still above zero. That means in aggregate, households are still adding to their savings. So there's kind of conflicting forces there. But yes, I would expect there to be some deterioration in the household balance sheet. That's what monetary tightening is trying to do. It's trying to take demand out of the economy. And that should be the ultimate impact. And you can already see that consumer demand is growing more slowly. I don't think it's going to end up in something really nasty though.
And one final question. Where do you see the AUD and USD exchange rate over the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, look, Aussie dollar versus US dollar, I expect will be stronger over the course of this year. It's not a runaway appreciation story for the Aussie, but I certainly think back above 70. Back to 70, 72 by the end of this year, and then maybe a little bit higher next year. China is not in a fantastic position, but it's kind of okay, and we still have some domestic interest rate hikes. And I think that climate transition also is keeping supply limited for commodities, which is keeping prices quite high. So those domestic sort of Australia factors should be enough to offset that China drag, I think.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was really, really interesting. And I can see the questions still keep coming in. So you've definitely piqued a lot of people's interest. So highly encourage you guys to follow up, get engaged with the ANZ research work as well. Next up, we have AI in finance operations. Is this myth or reality? And we also have the state of M&A in Australia. So pick your poison. Both slightly different, both very engaging. Again, thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for joining in. Hope this was a strong way to start your Tuesday.
Thanks, Adriana. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.